What an incredible few weeks it's been. We've had amazing guests who have so graciously shared their knowledge and wisdom with us. What they've all had in common is their contagious passion for Jesus. Today is no different. We dive deeper into some of the nuances of culture with our guest Greg Tate, where we look and ask questions around where do we draw the line between cultural triumphalism, where Christianity takes over every aspect of society, in politics, in economics, and everywhere else, and not leave room for others to participate within the culture. And that is what we call cultural triumphalism. And also juxtaposing it with cultural withdrawal on the other hand, where we look at culture, or where Christians look at culture and decide, actually, we will not engage with culture. So in other words, Christians should not be in politics, Christians should not run businesses, Christians should just completely withdraw from society, because after all, we are no longer of this world, but we're living for a heavenly kingdom. And also, where do we also draw the line when it comes to, actually, you know what, let's just live as everybody lives. In other words, having no different attributes to the culture that we see. That is otherwise known as cultural conformity. That's what Greg is going to be helping us to unpack today. Greg Tate is the leader of God First Parks, and he's also the leader of the Gauteng cohort of the Advanced Movement of Churches, which is a family of churches, a global family of churches, which has a passion for planting and strengthening churches. He is also my pastor, and he is a brother that loves Jesus and loves our nation, and he is married to Lauren Tate, and they are blessed with 3 beautiful children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. Hello and welcome to Context. We are thrilled that you have taken this time to be here with us, and we trust that you're going to grow and be equipped to live your best life for Jesus in our context. If this is your first time here, thank you for joining us, and I trust that you're going to find this channel beneficial to you. If you find this content beneficial to you, please consider subscribing and liking our channel. That does help us a great deal to ensure that we spread the gospel as much as possible. Without any delay, let us dive into today's discussion. And before we dive into our discussion today, I'm going to hand over to Greg Tate to let us know something interesting about himself, and then we'll dive into today's discussion.
Cool, Themba, great to be here. I should have brought my own praise singer. I think that would have helped. But I thought, given that we're talking about culture, I would wear some of my cultural clothing coming from the parks of Joburg. I didn't wear my Cape Union Mark shirt, but I brought my Woolworths jersey. And if you look on the back of my chair here, you'll see I've got my puffer jacket for winter in Joburg. I'm wearing my cultural attire, but it's great to be here. And again, this time talking about something that's a very important subject in our nation.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. And we are continuing on our Culture and Christ series. And before we dive into the details of that, or dive into today's discussion, I want to just play you a clip of Greg preaching, and take a listen.
You see, in our culture, we are welcome to be Jesus followers. We are welcome to follow Christ, so long as in our second breath we give equal validity to other faiths. So long as we don't try and persuade people to join us in our faith, and so long as we're willing to participate in multi-faith events. You see, the issues of our day and the issues of their day are issues of tolerance, religious tolerance, issues of diversity and religious pluralism. This was the context that we find these churches in. And Peter's concern is that as they came under pressure, that they would waver, that they would fold under pressure in their faith.
As they came under pressure, they will falter or they would waver. And I think the question there is that, so I hear you are exhorting us to follow Christ despite the pressure. But I think the question then begs is, as Christians, should we, whilst trying to resist the pressure, should we completely discard whatever's happening within the culture? You know, is God sovereign within the culture, or we need to buy into the belief, or should I say just the the assertion that as believers we are not of this world, we belong to an other kingdom, and it's either we completely disengage from this kingdom or we get so involved and we claim the victory of Christ in every area so that Christianity rules in all spheres of society.
Tough question. I think the answer is yes and yes. I mean, I think the preach was that was out of a series we did in the book of Peter, and I was giving context to the pressure that the Christians were under in those days to conform to the culture there. I think our cultural moment puts pressure on us as believers as well, differently. And I think there's two levels to this discussion. The one is in terms of respecting, honoring, acknowledging the work of God through our cultures, which I absolutely agree with. But I think at another level, which is more in line with what I was speaking about then, was our cultural moment promotes kind of tolerance as the new nirvana.
Sure.
And the Bible doesn't call us to tolerate others, but actually we're called to love, which
Sure.
is a higher standard,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Because I can tolerate someone and still hold them in disdain.
Sure.
You know, let's just talk on different cultures in South Africa. So I can be a Zulu or Zulu ethnic culture, and I can tolerate the fact that there are Tswanas living in my country, but I can still hold them in disdain and
Sure.
have a position of superiority over them. If I'm called to love someone, I don't think I can hold that disdain. You know, love is a higher standard where we're called to actually want the best for others and to love them like we would want to be loved. And so I think we're called to love, which is higher than the tolerance. So if I look at the cultural moment of tolerance being the ultimate, then
Sure.
I would say we've got a higher call on us. But then there's the other nuance that you're referring to, which so away from what I was saying is, if you're looking at cultural triumphalism, that actually as Christians we must take over and that nothing good comes out of any culture,
Sure.
then I would disagree. You know, then I would say, absolutely, God works in and through our cultures. There's good aspects. I mean, I loved Ryan 2 episodes ago was talking about the fact that all of our cultures have aspects that are really good, aspects that are not so good, and then kind of grey area in the middle, which we, you know, they're neither good nor bad. And I think there's parts of our cultures that we can redeem to the glory of God as well. So I absolutely don't think we need to go overboard in forcing everything to have a Christian title to it.
Sure. That's helpful. I affirm, even I like the fact that you are saying that we are not called to tolerance. And I think that is like the buzzword of our time. Just tolerate others. And I think the devil is in that word, you know, tolerance. And I think you calling us to a higher standard of loving. And I think even there, you know, it's like, okay, so I thought if I tolerate, that's enough. I've reached the bar of moral excellence. And you actually say, actually, that's mediocre. As far as Christ is concerned, we need to love, you know, and we need to love others. And I think now when we're speaking about loving others, what are we referring to? Are we saying we need to love others in a sense of loving the individual, you know, and like hating the sin, loving the individual, hating their culture, or tolerating their culture? I think maybe just to get into...
It gets tricky. I mean, that's a good thing to explore, because let's just talk about my home culture would be an white Anglo-South African kind of culture.
Yeah.
And yours, you coming from a Zulu kind of background. And I guess if we put it into that, I'm called to love you as an individual. I feel like as a South African, and I mean, some of this I'm just talking as I think. I think aloud, so it gets me in trouble often. So just for some grace there. But I feel as a South African, particularly as a believer in South Africa, I feel there is a call on me to love and appreciate Zulu culture, even though it's
Sure.
not my natural culture. Now there'll be things in your culture that I can easily affirm and say, wow, that's amazing, I love that. And there might be things that are harder for me to affirm, and they don't come so easy, and I don't maybe like them even. And that's where being in relationship, we can navigate those things together, because actually through talking to you, I can maybe understand some of those things better than just observing from where I sit.
Sure.
But I think, I don't know if you agree, but I think there is a call on us to seek to appreciate one another's cultures in a country like ours, as diverse as ours.
Sure. And interesting that you put it that way. I'm just looking at it within the South African context, and I think the main thing we are trying to get here is try and find the narrow road, as it were, that Christ calls us to. And there's obviously pitfalls on either side. And I think if we talk in the context of South Africa, I think we have often erred on the side of we deem things to, we give a title to cultural aspects of stuff. And so we would say this is Christian culture,
okay,
as opposed to, this is how I relate to the call that Jesus Christ has called me to love you, and so on. And so what I do is I would Christianize the way I personally do things. And so what that has often done is that when I see something completely different to how I've lived life or seen things being done, then I immediately find it to be outside the scope of what I've decided or determined, or at least the culture, the immediate culture within my surrounding has classified as Christian culture. And I'm just thinking in that sense, I think that is one extreme that I would say has happened in South Africa. But I would also say it is not coming from necessarily a bad place. Generally when somebody says, you want to live a holy life, you want to live a life that is honoring to God. And I think the first part of the question would be, is there aspects of culture that we as Christians have to completely disassociate it? I think you did mention it in passing, but also then secondly, are there parts of culture that we can say this is, even though I don't relate to it as such, this is culturally neutral, and you are mentioning that term. But then what is it going to take for us to be able to draw those distinctions? Because I guess the danger of the culture of our time is the whole thing of everything goes, and ultimately the main reason that we would have had in a context of ours where people will say, no, that's not Christian, is because there's always been a hesitancy to say everything goes, because you want to make sure all the time that you're following Christ. I hope I'm clear in.
Yeah, I think there's a few things you're raising there, but the one thing I'm hearing is the question, is there one Christian culture?
Right.
Which I think we have to say no. There's no one Christian culture. And our country is a helpful illustration. If you're talking about more monocultural societies, it might be easier to identify what a way of life following Christ is. I think absolutely we are aiming for kingdom values.
Sure.
And I think it's good to use illustration of very diverse cultures in our nation to express this. So let's just take a rural, let's use Zulu because of our cultures in the room. Let's talk about a rural Zulu village culture versus the Johannesburg northern suburbs kind of Anglo culture that I come from. And I think as I have come out of my culture into Christ, so I came to faith when I was 19, 20.
Sure.
19 and a half, somewhere there. I came out of my culture and increasingly adopted kingdom values, over the last few decades. And there's still vestiges of my culture in me.
Sure.
That I bring who I am into my current state.
Sure.
We need to abandon our old way of life, but there's parts of us, the way that we've been shaped and molded, that we bring with us.
Sure.
It's like we do marriage counseling and we always
talk to young couples getting married, and we talk about how the fact that they are bringing their family history into their new family.
Sure.
And people like to think sometimes, no, I've left that behind, I've rejected that, I've
Sure,
abandoned whatever.
sure.
But the reality is we've been trained in conscious and unconscious ways of how we do life.
Sure.
And equally, someone coming from a rural Zulu village, they would come out of their culture into Christ, and they would come into a new kingdom, because, the old is gone, the new has come, but they still bring with them parts of who they are as a Zulu person in SA. And that's where the challenge comes for them to identify what are the things that I need to jettison from my old culture as I step into the church and I embrace Christ.
Sure.
And I think the job is for all of us to do that, but it's going to look different for us because we're coming from a different culture. So how we express our kingdom culture is going to look different.
Yes, yeah.
And then I was saying, but there will be things that I see in your culture that I may choose to adopt because I like them.
Sure.
And vice versa. And the more time we spend together, there might be a coming together of our cultures in our expression of church or community. But to say that there's one kingdom culture, I just don't think it can be true, because we have different tastes in food and music, in dance, in all of the aspects that make up what culture looks like.
Sure. That's good. And I've been just chatting to a few guys. I mean, we were just reflecting on the South African context of, like, even the way you're explaining it now, of how we bring ourselves but we let go of ourselves. It sounds very contradictory in its by design, because there's this thing of the kingdom now but not yet. There's this thing that I'm saved, I've been regenerated but not fully regenerated. That type of at least what the gospel calls us to become better. But the aspect of that, actually, even within your culture, God was actually working despite you actually being conscious of the fact that God is working. And I think that is something that is often lost in plain sight, that God really work in a culture that is in a pagan society, for example? Can he have any lasting divine influence, notwithstanding the fact that the people themselves have not pledged their allegiance to him?
Yeah, I absolutely would say yes. I personally have a big view of God's ability to work through people. I mean, we see it in the Old Testament. If you look at the story of Israel and Judah, God used pagan nations to bring punishment on them,
Sure.
take them into captivity, to bring about things in his plan. I mean, even if you think of how Joseph was used in Egypt.
Sure.
Egypt was used, pagan nation was used, okay, a godly man was there, but was used to feed the world at the stage, to keep them alive from a massive famine. So I think God definitely is able to use people who don't even follow him, secular institutions. You just think about some of the issues that have been worked out in the last 100 years. If you think of women's rights,
Sure.
if you think of protection of children,
Sure.
From abuse and forced child labor and whatnot. I mean, some of these things are still a problem in the world, but
Sure.
many of the advances that have happened in democratic societies have come through secular politicians pushing a cause.
Sure.
Many times Christians have been behind that. But, even if you think about the protection of minorities,
Sure.
like homosexual communities, 50 years ago, they were massively persecuted. But there have been secular people who've actually helped to bring laws about that protect the rights of vulnerable people, like
Sure.
minorities. So I think, God definitely works in and through secular society.
Sure. And I think that brings us to, he works through secular society. And I think it brings us right to an immediate context now of, we have politicians, we have politics, we have all these things. And, and so, I'm just laughing because I must concede that I've got my views that they need sanctification when it comes to the whole area of politics and some of the things that we've become accustomed to within the political space. But the question then begs is that can Christians actually pursue careers in politics, for instance, and support certain laws? When you look, and I think one of the laws that I would be I'm going to press you on is the law, for example, on homosexuality, where now we know what the Bible says as far as homosexual living is concerned, where it says, a marriage is between a husband and a wife. But then when you're finding yourself as a Christian politician in that space, can you effectively still fulfill the mandate God has given you within that type of an environment?
Yeah, look, I think it's a complex road to walk.
Sure.
So firstly, to answer the first question, absolutely, we need Christians in political spaces. Sure. We need Christians in every sphere of society. Sure. And the worst thing is that we adopt the opposite of triumphalism is a quietism approach. Sure. Where we abstain from life, really, and we just live in little enclaves of holy huddles. That would be the worst outcome. That's not the way I see the Bible teaching us to live.
For us to all be monks, or
just
totally. Go and live in some mountain somewhere.
And in fact, if you look in the New Testament, there are political people that come to faith, and there's no sense in which they now need to abandon their posts.
Sure.
They now to work their faith out where they are.
Sure.
I think it is complex in our political landscape, so we have a very strong party led, or let me rephrase that, issues around voting, around issues of law generally fall on party lines.
Sure.
So unfortunately, our political parties don't allow politicians to vote according to conscience.
Sure.
Which I do think is a problem, So I do think, I remember having discussions with ANC MP around issues like at the time the abortion laws were being promulgated. And if it were me, I would find it very difficult to vote in support of a law on a moral issue that I feel strongly on.
Sure.
Let's just use abortion as an example. And if I were the politician in that situation, I think I would probably abstain. If my party insisted I voted in a certain way, I'd probably abstain from voting.
Sure.
There might be consequences. And I think that's the reality with our party system, is that there are consequences for people who don't toe the party line, which is sad, because actually then it promulgates a system where people just, you have to suck up and follow the party line if you want to advance in politics.
Right.
So I think there are some issues around that, but really I think we absolutely need Christians involved in political life. I would love it if they were able to vote on these big moral issues according to conscience rather than because a party forced them to. But yeah, that's my view on.
Sure, and I think what I'm hearing you say here is that, well, politics is part of God's design, and I guess not many of us would like to actually concede to that fact, but ultimately God is sovereign, and He's designed it the way it. In fact, nothing happens unless one it's allowed by Him or approved by Him. One of the two. So His sovereignty is not limited, and in this moment in time, He's chosen to allow or approve of the political way of doing things. But I do get the sense that you're saying politics is important, but is not of ultimate importance.
Absolutely.
Which means there is a big moral duty that just because we are affirming something, we're saying it's good to drive a car, but it's not good to drive that car and somebody says knock people over. So there's got to be the fact that my allegiance is not to the capacity of the car, but it's my conscience being governed by my submission to Christ. That should always dictate how I approach things.
Absolutely. I think that would be true of a business person.
Sure.
If you were working for one of the big banks and you had a role where you were having to make certain investment decisions and the boss was telling you to do something illegal, you have a moral obligation to refuse that instruction.
Sure.
If you were employed in the military and the officer over you told you to annihilate a village of innocent women and children, you have a moral obligation to stand up and say no, even if it costs you your job. So even if you are fired from the bank, even if you're court-martialed in the military, you have a moral obligation to follow Christ first. And I think that would be true of politicians, you know. And part of the problem of where we are in this nation, if we talk politics, is that we don't have enough Christians involved in politics who are willing to make a stand for what is right.
Sure, willing to make a stand for what is right. And I think, you know, and I guess we are trying to just navigate the narrow path of doing this thing well. And I'm saying this being mindful of the context of South Africa, where we had a situation where I think whether it's Nelson Mandela, whether it's my father, you know, for whatever reason, I'm fortunate in the sense that I don't, for example, have an English name. Not to say that English names are evil, but not an English name that is given to me by a Home Affairs official who tells me that, hey, listen, we need to give you a Christian name. Because Themba, you know, is not never mind that it says hope, you know, but because it's not said in English, for example, you know, it's not a Christian name, and so you must be given something different. And I guess even, you know, whether you're talking about Nelson Mandela being Rolihlahla, then given Nelson, and there's so many people, you know, who are given these names because it was under the banner that we are Christianizing society. And I think even every time we say Christians, hey, don't hold back, get involved in politics, get involved in real life and community meetings, get involved within your society, impact and influence from within. Many people get nervous and say, I know when that happened here, we were told that we can't have our names, we can't do these things. And I guess now in that sense, you know, where is the line to be drawn as far as how much Christian influence, you know, can be what God intends for us to have? You know, when does it become, you know, triumphalistic in a way that completely annihilates anything that is foreign to how I perceive Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit here. As much as we want Christians in politics, if you are 18 years old and you're thinking about what to study, please don't go and study politics. We've got too many people with political degrees that are no use to of little use.
Sure.
Rather go and study to become a teacher. Go and study to become a doctor. Go and study to be able to get a job that can contribute meaningfully to our society. And then moving on to your question, we get into politics not seeking power, not seeking influence, but coming with an attitude to serve. You see, so if we go into a place with an attitude to serve and God promotes us to a place of prominence and power, of influence, praise God for that. And then we use whatever influence He's given us for His glory. I think the risk is that people think, I want to be a politician because I want to have power. I want to have influence. I want to, well, in South Africa, you could argue some people even, I want a good paycheck. That for me is the wrong reason to be involved in political life. Political life should be a life of service. And so it starts with coming in with an attitude to serve. I'm coming in to serve this community as a teacher or whatever it is. As an administrative official in the local council, whatever it is. I come in, I serve, I do my job with excellence and allow God to promote me within those structures to a place where I then begin having a political influence or voice. And I think too often in South Africa, the approach and the way in is not one of service. And I think actually we called as Christians to lay down our lives for others and to serve. And if we start with that attitude, I think then we can get into those areas of influence for the right reasons. And so then we begin influencing for God, because our motivation isn't money or power. Our motivation is the glory of Christ. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I think that's what came to mind while you were asking that.
on its own, is it wrong for a Christian to desire to have influence? In a sense that, I believe as a believer, the more I'm in that space, I need to influence for Christ. Did you understand what I'm saying?
I don't think it's wrong. I mean, the Bible even talks about, when it's talking about elders, it says you should desire the office, and that's around leadership.
Sure.
Influence and leadership are, what is leadership? It's influence.
Sure.
So I think it's good. I don't think it's wrong to desire influence. It's desire to lead, but the motivation is service, not my glory.
Yeah.
I think that is the key issue here. And so to desire influence for the glory of Christ is a wonderful thing. But if I'm desiring influence just because they're going to name an airport after me when I die, I think then we've gone wrong.
Sure. And I guess, the big takeaway is that ultimately when we are doing anything, and I guess it's not just politics, is that motives do matter when you are a child of God. That ultimately why you do what you do, is of utmost importance. That notwithstanding the end product, it can end well. And I think this is where the whole thing of God's sovereignty comes in, because there are people who come with bad intentions, but God allows it in His sovereignty to bring about good. But ultimately, as a believer, that's not something that you aim to do things out of bad motives.
Yeah.
It's ultimately to say, how can I glorify God in here? How can I, doing what I'm doing? And I would even go as far as saying, even if it means, directly you'd say you enter politics, for example, but as long as the motive and you are sensitive to God, that is a noble thing that we need to do, and we shouldn't shy away from it. And I think, though, is that now a lot of believers within our context, it's always this thing of we look at other people's intentions, other people, or how other people went about it, and we throw the baby with the bathwater.
Which comes to the name story again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can't, that's exactly, just because people have done badly in the past doesn't mean we should avoid it in the future.
Sure.
I think that would be my simple answer for what you were mentioning about the names, It was wrong. It was a wrong application. It was built on a false premise, and so it doesn't mean that therefore going forward we shouldn't be seeking to work in Department of Home Affairs where we are helping people with their identities,
Sure, because I think even the danger, though, is that we do get into a space where everything is wrong, everything is not well, but we are not willing to, because I think there's also this real thing that God says we are supposed to be the salt of the earth. And one of the characteristics of salt is preservation, to preserve things. That ultimately the hope is that when you have Christians in key places where corrupt activities are taking place or where injustice is taking place, the Christian voice in there doesn't think of my bank account first, doesn't think of preserving my flesh first, but says, hey, I was here to begin with. I was here because I was incentivized and motivated by my complete allegiance to Jesus Christ. And so when time comes for me to stand up for His name, notwithstanding the consequences, and I guess even it goes back to what you were saying earlier, when it's like vote for abortion, the Bible, that's clearly wrong. It's like literally legalized genocide, that we, under the guise of law and sort of scientific pontification, which when you really look at it, ultimately what you are doing, you are messing around where God should be allowed to reign supreme in the bringing of life into this world. And so as a Christian politician, for example, is that even if there is a situation where you either vote for this or you're out, not that you mustn't think about it, but it should be clear as day what to do. It's like, I stand for Christ, and let every man be proven a liar, but I'm going to submit to Christ. And I think we see that even with the apostles, and I guess it does come back to the opening clip we were playing earlier on of, hey, actually, guys, don't, when Peter's like, the whole thing of compromise, that I think there's a difference between engaging culture than actually compromising so that you can further your survival in it and further your nest, as it were, as opposed to just saying, hey, You're voting for abortion. As a believer, I'm not going to support that. And if you guys want to get rid of me because of that, it's actually a noble thing. And the Bible says to us, rejoice when you suffer because you are doing good. You know, there's obviously suffering for doing wrong things where I steal stuff for my own stupidity. And then I'm like, oh, I'm suffering for the kingdom. But the reality is I'm not doing what God has called me to do. So I guess then the whole thing here is we need to get to a space where we get involved, but on the other hand, we don't get too involved to the point that we are compromising.
I mean, it's hard sitting here where we're not living in that space of politicians. Sure. I don't want to be too critical of them, but I think, wouldn't it be amazing if we had Christian politicians who had served their constituencies, had served in whatever portfolios they'd been given, to the point where there was such a groundswell of support for them that the party dare not jettison them if they disagree on something.
Sure.
Because of the support that they have, where people are so respected and followed, let's use the word, for the character that they have exhibited and the service they have done, that the people go to the leaders of the party and say, don't you dare get rid of Themba, because he is the best Minister of Health that we could have.
Sure.
It was such a groundswell. Unfortunately, politics in many ways is a career, and so for many of them, they make decisions that best serve their career. I don't want to get too much into that, but I'm trying to be idealistic here in terms of what would the ideal be, is that Christians serve in those spaces with the moral courage to say no when they're forced into situations that are against the Bible. But I guess the bigger thought here is that that whole idea of common grace, because actually when we look at the whole of society, if we just look at our South African society, there's so much blessing that we have that comes, which is actually a result of common grace. It's
Sure.
the goodness of God to us that we don't deserve as a nation, not just as Christians. So as Christians, those who follow Christ, we would say that we've received the special grace of salvation. We've received forgiveness for our sins, that we have been brought out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. We are now children of God. But actually the majority of our nation, I don't think, are disciples of Jesus.
Sure.
They might tick they're Christian on a form because they're not a Muslim or Hindu or some other faith camp, but I don't think the majority of our nation are actually following Christ as disciples. And yet our nation has, we have food to eat. We have we've got so many good things here, and I just think that is the kindness of God to us. And I mean, Jesus even says the sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous.
Yep.
And so the sun shines on our nation, despite the fact that the majority of our people are not followers of Jesus. And so we have to acknowledge that there's good things that God brings to us through non-Christian sources.
And I guess even when we pray for, and we say we're praying for bread, our Father, give us this daily bread. Ultimately, I'm not sure which said, I think it's Martin Luther, where he said, actually, God is actually working not just, through Christian hands, but he's also working through the baker in the bakery. So Albany or Blue Ribbon, I'm not advertising anyone here, but the point is, the manager or the guy, kneading the dough, is not necessarily, or the guy who made the bakery system that produces the dough, may not well be a Christian, but we pray and we receive and we consume. And I guess again in the context of South Africa, where we've often lost this aspect of common grace, where I come from a background where growing up, if you took Panados, you are like, you are not a Christian, because how dare you not trust God to heal your headache, for example, because there's this thing of we could not see God working through the doctor. for example, who's potentially an atheist, but is gifted with just medical acumen and ability to design things that provide relief. And so we were not able to see God's grace in that. But on the flip side of it, we didn't react the same way when we bought bread, from a non-believer. So we could consume the bread, but we couldn't consume something else, like something produced by an atheist doctor, like medication, simply because that part of things was demonstrative of the fact that I lacked faith. But on the other hand, I didn't pray, and like bread popped out of nowhere if I didn't have the flour.
Stones didn't become bread.
The stone didn't become bread, and I think now, just getting back to the South African space, where would you say we went wrong as far as just comprehending God's far-reaching sovereignty in Him executing and providing common grace on the saved and the unsaved?
Sure. Gosh, I guess it would be different in different faith traditions. So the charismatic movement, it would be different from the Pentecostal movement, because they all had a different moves of God at different times. But I mean, I guess if I think of your example, the classic error typically comes in the area of understanding of what does it mean to live by faith.
Sure.
And that is there's no simple answer to that, because I mean, even Jesus, or in the New Testament, we read about where people have different faith to eat different things or drink different things, and we're called not to stumble one another, but equally we're called not to judge one another.
Sure.
So if I'm eating this food and you are uncomfortable to eat it, you're called not to be offended with me. And so I guess when it comes to these issues of faith, it is somewhat up to I don't want to say individuals, but our own walk of faith. But there's also the reality that we have to acknowledge that God is bigger than just working through Christian organizations or Christian, Christianized institutions, let's say. So I think we have to have a big view of God's sovereignty and His ability to work. And I mean, I think one of the wrestles which is different to yours, but I've often had people say that actually to take life insurance is lacking faith.
Sure.
And my comeback normally would be, well, I wouldn't see it as that. I would say, actually, I want to be responsible to care for my family it's not if, but when I die. Now, the level of insurance that one would take may be an issue of faith. Because I think your classic insurance salesman will come and put the numbers in the spreadsheet and wada, and the number that comes out will be a massive number typically.
Sure.
And I think that is when we can give into fear. And that's the wrestle between fear and faith, and say, well, actually, to go and try and insure against this eventuality is just giving into fear of the worst possible outcome and no trust that actually God can care for my children or my wife beyond me. And it's working out that level of which is just being responsible and which is giving into fear. And then with faith saying, this is where I'm going to draw the line. And I think it's with all these issues, it's fear and faith that are fighting against each other. And we need to be a people of faith.
Sure.
And not give in to fear. But we also can't be ridiculous in our triumphalism and throw our brains out of the equation, because I mean we've been given a brain to think, we've been given reason to apply, and I think there's good reason why we have reasonable thought to put into these things, and I think some of the triumphalistic approaches just throws all common sense out of the equation, and it becomes ridiculous.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting that you're mentioning like that we need to keep our brains. So, and the previous podcast, Sitli mentioned the fact that we are called for the renewal of your mind, not the removal of your mind.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes we kind of want to remove the mind, and not engage with the mind. And I think even while we are talking, there could be a doctor listening, because again, you are a doctor and you are serving, or you're an insurance sales official, and like, should I actually even consider that? What if I'm getting people to actually exhibit things that are not consistent and not honorable from having faith perspective? Because again, the triumphalism, if I take a stance that insurance is sinful or medication is sinful, then it means that every single Christian doctor is actually being rebellious and not following a godly pattern.
Which is crazy. I mean, Luke was a doctor.
Absolutely.
And he wrote 2 books of the New Testament. I just think that's the kind of thinking that is not thinking when
Sure.
we get into that. That is the worst kind of Christian triumphalism, I think, out there when we actually put our brains away. I mean, I think Sitli, what he said was absolutely right. And going back to the insurance example, it just takes for you to sit with a widow with young children where the husband has passed away and there was no life insurance.
Sure.
And you look at the barren situation, and you look at the fact that this person had a good job and he was spending thousands every month on buying a car, but he couldn't even put a few $100,000 into an insurance policy to care for for education of his children. And you sit there and you think, no, this can't be the right either. So these are all valid and excellent professions, but it's engaging with faith. I mean, there's so many Christians in medicine. Every year we have a crop of medical students that come through our church. There are many people who've gone into those fields with a view to serving, to caring for people, and many other professions as well. People are engaging with faith.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I guess that's the hard thing. And I think in the South African context, we've not always had, and I guess this is the blessing and the curse of a majority Christian country, that a lot of things, we do in a way that is informed by Scripture, but there's always that crossing the Rubicon in the negative area. And I'm just asking this question for a potential Nicodemus. And I've engaged with a few Nicodemuses who not necessarily subscribe to the Christian faith, but they love this engagement, love the debate, And one of the big things that keep popping up is, again, this whole thing of, when we look at South Africa's history, whether we look at apartheid, looking at, I mentioned the issue of people, the name, that actually your name is culturally not Christian, and so we need to change your name. What would you say to somebody who looks at South Africa and say, but hey, hang on a second, you guys are saying something completely different to how many South Africans perceive Christianity? When they look at us, or look at Christianity juxtaposed against other faiths, whether it's, let's say, for example, it's Hinduism, which is polytheistic, all roads lead to salvation, whereas as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ is the only way. But what do we say to somebody saying, but what you guys are saying is not consistent to my experience of Christianity, where Christianity has always come across as, you whitewash and wipe away every aspect of my culture and all these things, and then you want me to be a particular way, and now they are struggling with engaging with Christianity because immediately it almost says I need to not exist in all my facets, whether neutral or even good aspects of it, for me to be a Christian.
Yeah, we're back. We've done a circle to this, and I think, this is a pain point in our nation. And I think we have to, as evangelicals, own the fact that lots of mission, although born out of the right motive, I believe, in many instances, was executed in a highly unhelpful way, because I don't think people had engaged with a lot of thought around what does it mean to bring the gospel to other cultures. And in the colonial era, the gospel was going out at the same time that the colonial project was happening.
Sure.
And so sadly, these things got conflated. And so you had many missionaries being sent out from the West at that stage, or Western Europe mainly, into places like Africa, South Africa, that's says. So we had many, and I believe if you read many of the memoirs of some of those missionaries, God got hold of them. They responded in faith.
Yeah.
But the clothing that they went out in was unhelpful.
Sure.
Making people change the way they dress, change their names. This is ludicrous. I mean, today we wouldn't never dream of behaving like that. But I think I'm going to say a few things in and out here, so forgive me if it's a bit confused. You said a majority Christian country. I think, although the stats would say that 75% of our nation are Christian,
right,
it's impossible. If you look at our society, that cannot be.
Yeah.
That 75% of the people are following Christ.
Fruitless Christians.
And I think this is the main challenge when we have these discussions and people look at Christianity as a religion.
Yeah.
Is that it was like I grew up as a cultural Christian.
Sure.
So I was sent to an Anglican school. That's because Anglican church, because I was at an Anglican school, because that's the family I grew up in.
Sure.
And so I always ticked the form that I was a Christian, all the way until I was 19, when I actually encountered the risen Christ. And there was a moment when I repented of my sin and I chose to follow Christ.
Sure.
The gospel came alive to me. Before that, I could tell you the story. I could tell you the Christmas story. I could tell you the Easter story. I could tell you the story of Noah. I could tell you the story of Jonah in the whale, and all these stories that I'd learned through my Christian culture. But it wasn't a real lived experience for me. And when I was 19, I had an encounter where God showed me or revealed himself to me, and I realized this wasn't just stories. This was truth that I embraced, and I was changed.
Sure.
And I think that many people in South Africa would tick the Christian box as a cultural Christianity of some form or other. Many of them wouldn't it wouldn't be a pure cultural Christianity. It would be a mixed cultural Christianity, because they might be mixing other cultural practices with a little bit of church or whatever it is. And so the way I read the scriptures, the way I read the Bible, I don't think those people are disciples of Jesus.
Sure.
They are ascribing to a religious term or name. Now, if we go back to the missionaries and the history of our country, despite all the negative things that happened, there were some positive things that happened in terms of the fact that our many of our laws and things came, excluding the obvious bad ones, the apartheid ones. But in terms of what has happened has largely been influenced by a Judeo-Christian ethic. So there is some good in terms of human rights and stuff that we have inherited through that journey, which if you look at other countries that come from a Judeo-Christian background, there are some of those benefits that have come to us. But I absolutely, as much as people say we're a Christian country, I'm not that comfortable with that, because I don't believe that 75% of the people are actually living for Jesus, following Jesus with faith. It's more of a cultural position.
Sure.
And I think there's a difference between having a cultural position of faith or being someone who's actively following Christ.
Sure. No, that's helpful.
And much of the judgment comes around the cultural Christianity, right? So much of so even the apartheid, which to some degree was backed by the Dutch Reformed Church, there was a cultural taking of using Christianity to back a cultural narrative, which it was wrong.
Sure.
It's not justifiable if you read the scriptures. What was done, it was horrific, and so it's desperately sad that so many terrible things were done in our nation in the name of Christianity. I don't believe that was a true Christian faith being expressed at all.
And ultimately, I guess getting from what you're reminding us of is the fact that we should resist the urge to throw the baby with the bathwater. That ultimately we used the car earlier on, that a car is an innocuous thing. Just because a car is used by somebody else to knock 10,000 people down, it doesn't necessarily mean that the car itself is bad. And I guess even just the call of Christ, that just because I decide, hey, there's this amazing thing, there is a message that is solid that people receive, but then I use that. I mean, it can even happen now, like in our church context, where somebody gets up, takes the mic. And how can I enrich myself?
It's happening.
It's happening. You know what I mean? And so it's like, absolutely. And if I need a Bentley and I need, well, not to say anything's wrong with Bentley, 10 jets, and the ultimate motive is for me, to glorify myself. It doesn't negate the power of the message. It doesn't negate the fact that Jesus Christ died and he rose again, and his message of redemption still pulls us in, and God still works even in those situations. It just simply means somebody got a hold of something good and began to execute evil, notwithstanding the fact that they were holding something good as an instrument to actually effect that evil.
Yeah, I mean, and if you go back to the, like 100 years ago, there were missionaries who were loving the people in a way that Christ loved the people. So you look at some of the leaders of the liberation struggle. They were educated by, these Catholic mission schools where there were these missionaries who had come from other nations who gave themselves to educate people in opposition to the apartheid legislation. Or the colonial legislation in terms of Bantu education. They refused to do that, and they educated people like Mandela. And so you have people living their faith out in a way that we would endorse in the midst of a situation where there's other people using our faith as a justification to do evil. Yeah, no, that's good. Just mentioning Mandela, no, Chief Albert Luthuli, one of the first, well, not one, the first president of the ANC, was an evangelist, and he was born again and believed in the power of the gospel. And so ultimately, I think the end message is the gospel is still powerful, it's potent, it may have been used in ways that are dishonorable, but it doesn't mean that the message of Christ itself is dishonorable. And any parting shots, Greg? No. Thank you for having me again. It's great to talk about these big issues. I love living in this country and the challenges we face in navigating some of these things. Privileged to be here, Themba. Keep going. Thanks for having me. No, thank you so much, Greg. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. I think I've been enriched. We've been empowered. And I think we are better off by having this discussion. And hopefully you as the listener, you are as blessed as I have been and have taken some notes and wrestled with some issues. And let us know if there's anything that you disagree with or you want to add to what we are saying. Please send us. There's an email in the description of the podcast. But other than that, thank you so much for listening. Next week, we further this discussion. We have an amazing lady who is the co-founder or the founding director of the Kopanya Institute. And she's going to be helping us unpack how do we heal from cultural hurt, especially in racialized spaces. In other words, when we talk about culture and we're asking our people to be involved in multicultural churches, oftentimes what happens, because of the racialized environment that we come from, we end up, whether intentionally or unintentionally, hurting each other, whether through feeling that we are superior to others or feeling that we're inferior to others. We end up hurting each other whilst trying to do life together. And our next guest for next week is going to help us with the process of healing
Firstly, how to identify racial hurt, how to prevent racial hurt, and also when there is racial hurt, how can we move on to healing, repentance, lament, and also making sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes as we try and do multiculturalism well within our churches. With those words, I want to say, Sa Lani God. Yeah, till next time. Cheers. Bye bye.